Welcome to Gemara Academy. In this class, we will learn Tosfos Dibur HaMaschil Egez al Gabe Mayim Lav Hainu Anachase. Let's begin by looking at the flowchart of the Gemara, so we could see what Tosfos is coming to explain. So here in the Gemara, we presented a teaching from Rava who said Egez al Gabe Mayim Lav Hainu Anachase, which means that a nut that's floating on water is not considered at rest, and therefore, if somebody would carry this nut out into another rishus, he won't be chayiv. And so too, if somebody would carry the nut into that rishus and place it on the water, he's not going to be chayiv. So let's see the general outline of Tosfos. And the Gemara presented the teaching of Rava, who said, Egez al gabe mayim lav hainu anochasei, that a nut that's floating on water is not considered to be at rest. So there's two parts of Tosfos. The main part of Tosfos is that Tosfos is going to explain that what defines being or not being at rest will vary depending on what we're talking about. In other words, it's not that there is a general idea of what's at rest and it'll apply everywhere. It depends. Like we'll see that by Shabbos, what's considered at rest, it follows one thing. There's a certain set of requirements and criteria. However, regarding Kinyan, what's considered at rest follows a different set of requirements and criteria. And then the second part of Tosfos is going to be a side discussion that is a result of what we're going to learn. In the main part of Tosfos, Tosfos is going to continue on with this discussion a little further. So let's see the Tosfos now in the flowchart form. So in the Gemara, we presented the teaching of Rava, who said, Egez al gabe mayim lav hainu anochase, that a nut that's floating on water is not considered to be at rest. So Tosfos says, and it's an arrow, because Tosfos is not actually presenting a question. He's supporting what it says in the Gemara. And he's saying that even though elsewhere we see something else, nevertheless, it's okay. So he's supporting what it says in the Gemara. So let's see what he points out. Even though we say that a ship is considered at rest on water, and it's the water that's moving it, the din is that a chatzar mahalechas einei koina. A moving chatzar does not have the ability to be koine, to acquire for the owner items that are in it. Nevertheless, the din is that a fish jumped into an individual's ship. The ship is koine for the owner, the fish that jumped into it. So the question is asked, how does the ship have this ability if it's a chatzar mahaleches? It's a moving chatzar. The ship is floating on the water. And the Gemara explains that we say that the ship is fully at rest. The ship is not the one that's moving, like an animal that moves. Rather, the ship is fully at rest. And it's just that the water moves it. So over here, we would think to say the same thing. The nut is fully at rest, and it's the water that's moving it. We find the distinction, that the nut we say is not at rest, and the ship we say is at rest. So Tosfos explains that being that it's an entirely different subject, the requirements are different. By a kinyan, it's different, and it's not considered a chatzar ma'alecha. So Tosfos doesn't explain it. He's going to continue on and explain it. But for now, Tosfos just points out that being that that in that case, it's not a case of Shabbos. We're referring to a case of kinyan. By a kinyan, the requirements and conditions to be considered a chatzar mahalechas or not are different than what we're looking at on Shabbos. So what's the explanation? So that'll be in another arrow. Tosfos is going to support what he just said. He says, because we learned the din of chatzar, the whole din of chatzar is learned out from a person's hand, from a yad. So we say, just like the hand is at rest, but as the body moves, the hand moves along, and nevertheless the hand is not considered a chatzar mahalechas, it's considered to be at rest. The same is true for the ship. As the water moves, the ship moves along, but the ship itself is at rest, and therefore it's not considered to be a chatzar mahalechas. So that's how it works by kinyan. So by kinyan, the focus is looking at yad, the hand of a person. If it's different than the person's hand and there's more movement, then it's a chatzar mahalechas. However, if the extent of the movement is similar to the extent of the movement of a yad, of a person's hand, then it will not be considered a chatzar mahalechas. However, by Shabbos, what we pay attention to is whether it would have been done in the Mishkan. Is this a normal thing to do? If people want to set aside some items, would they place it in such a place, in such a manner? And the answer is they wouldn't when it comes to Egez al gabe mayim. If a person has something that he needs to put aside or store, he's not going to put it on top of water to float. So therefore, the focus by Shabbos and the focus by Kinyan is different. The conditions that consider something to be at rest by Shabbos are, is this the way people do things? And the conditions for something to be at rest by Kinyan is whether it's similar to the yad, to the hand of a person. So this is the first part of Tosfos, the main part of Tosfos, where he presents the distinction between Kinyan and Shabbos. And the main thing that we're saying over here is how exactly we look at Shabbos. And the focus by Shabbos is this the way people do things? Would somebody store items? Would somebody set aside items in such a manner, in such a place? Now that Tosfos mentioned this, that the focus is would somebody put aside things in such a place, he continues on to a side discussion. And he says, and that's why Rava continues. And he asks, referring to Rava, if placing a nut in a container, when the container is floating on water, is a way people place things. The next question of Rava was, Egez al gabe mayim lav hainu anochase. Then we presented a question of Rava, which was, how about egeiz bikli vikli tzaf al gabe mayim? If the nut is in a container and the container is floating on water, is that considered at rest? Because the question is that the way people place things? If somebody had some items that he needed to set aside for a little while, and there was a container floating on water, would he place them there or not? The question is asked because it's possible that people will do such a thing, it's possible that they won't, and therefore Rav has this question. Tosfos continues and says, even though it's not considered at rest. Now we can understand the next question of Rava. Is that considered at rest or not? Even though generally it's not considered at rest, like we'll see in a moment. So even though it's not considered at rest, Rava still asks his question. And the reason is because by Shabbos, the focus is this the way people would place things? Would somebody set aside items in a container that's floating on water? And now let's see where we find that an egeiz in a kli on water would not be considered at rest. And we'll see even some of them pertain to Shabbos itself. So let's see the three examples. So we're going to present over here three different Gemaras. So we're going to have a bit of a side discussion in explaining each Gemara. So number one is, like we say, Rachov k'mahalach dami. The din is if somebody's Rebbe is walking by him, he's obligated out of derech eretz to stand up to respect his teacher. If a Rebbe, the din is that if his Rebbe is riding on an animal, he's also chayav to stand up, because we say Rachov k'mahalach dami, and Tosfos is equating the two cases, just like the egeiz in the kli, and it's floating on water. We have the egeiz fully stable and comfortable on the kli, but the kli is on the water, so therefore we have a question. The same is by the person, the Rebbe, on the horse. The Rebbe is fully at rest on the animal, but the animal is moving. Nevertheless, by the case of Rachov, we say Rachov k'mahalach dami, it's not considered at rest. But by the egeiz b'kli, we have a question. And the reason is because the focus is not if it's at rest or not. The focus is this something that people would do? Now, another two cases which are going to be actually in Shabbos itself. It says if a person places something, Tosfos is saying, if a person places something on a walking person, it isn't considered at rest. And again, Tosfos is making an equivalent between the two cases of somebody having an item placed on him, so the item is fully at rest on a walking person, and the egeiz on a container which is floating on the water. So the egeiz in the container floating on water, we have a question if it's at rest or not, even though if somebody had an item placed on him while walking, it's not considered at rest. How do we know it's not considered at rest? So now we're going to present a Gemara. It says a person may place things on his animal after it starts walking and removes it when it stops. The din is that if somebody had items Erev Shabbos and he realized he's not going to make it home, one of the things that the Mishnah says he's allowed to do is he could place it on his animal and then remove it from his animal. So the Gemara explains that what he does is, once the animal starts walking, he puts it onto the animal, and then after when the animal stops, he lifts it. And then again, he waits for the animal to start walking, and he places it on the animal. And then when the animal stops, he takes it off. The reason he does this is so that the animal doesn't carry the item. But we see from the fact that we say he could place it on the animal once it starts walking, that's not considered a hanacha. And the Mefarshim discuss how we see that. But at any rate, Tosfos is bringing this Gemara to show that when it's being placed on the animal, while the animal's walking, it's not considered a hanacha. So the same is true if it's placed on a person while he's walking, it's not considered to be a hanacha, even though it seems to be the same as egeiz b'kli, which is floating on water. And the last and final Gemara that Tosfos brings down to show that it's not considered at rest is, it says if a person carried out ink, the amount of 2 letters, and as he was walking, he wrote those letters down on a piece of parchment, on a piece of paper. He's chayav for the malacha of Eitzah, because he carried it out, and he wrote it. That's the hanocha of the ink. That indicates that only if he wrote it on a piece of parchment, somewhere that it's going to stay forever, is it considered a proper hanocha. However, if he took this ink that was in the container and he poured it into another container, it wouldn't be considered a hanocha, even though it's the same exact as the egeiz b'kli, which is on the water. Here we have the egeiz, the nut, in the kli, and we have the ink being placed in the kli. And in one case, it's on top of the water. In the other case, it's a moving person. So even though these two cases seem to be exactly alike, nevertheless, we find the distinction that by the ink, we're going to say that he's potter. Only if he writes it on a piece of parchment is he chayiv. It's a proper anocha. But not if he places it into another container. And by the egeiz b'kli shetzaf al gabe mayim, Rava has a question. And the reason is because what we're looking at by Shabbos is this the way that people do things? Ink into a container while somebody's walking is not hanacha. However, it might be the hanacha. It might be a proper way to do an hanacha for somebody to place some items that he has and he wants to set aside to place them in a container that's floating on water. So really the whole point of Tosfos, we'll just summarize, the main point of Tosfos is to bring out that the focus by Shabbos is if this is the way, if this is derech b'nei adam, if this is the manner of people to place things, and in each situation it might be different depending on the details and the circumstances, and as a result, to put a nut on water is not a hanacha, since that's not the way people place things or set things aside. However, to put a nut in a container that was floating on water possibly is the way people would do things, and therefore regarding that, Rava has a question.